Welcome, Rotarians and guests, to the Rotary Club of York, where our mission is to improve life in the city of York by connecting our club's diverse community leaders through fellowship, action, and service. I am your president, Courtney Piccolo, and as you know, we start off all of our meetings by reciting the four-way test. If you'd please join me. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? Today, our opening song, America, My Country 'Tis of Thee, and the Pledge will be led by Steve Feldman, followed by the Invocation by past President Glenn Miller, and visitor introductions by the birthday boy, Aaron Rank.
Please join me. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the Pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good morning, friends. In 1774, the Anglican priest and founder of Methodism, John Wesley, wrote his observations of his fellow men and women during the parliamentary election of that year, a contentious election, apparently, an election in which Wesley noted that, quote, in every county, city, and town, men who were once of calm, mild, friendly temper are now mad with party zeal, foaming with rage against their neighbors, ready to tear out one another's throats and to plunge their swords into each other's bowels, end quote. Sound familiar? His response was to write to his fellow Methodists with three simple rules for approaching the civic task of voting, especially within the context of faith. 1, to vote without fee or reward for the person they judge most worthy. 2, to speak no evil of the person they voted against. And perhaps most important, number 3, to take care that their spirits were not sharpened against those that voted on the other side. Sage wisdom, even the day after an election. Let us pray. Lord God of the nations, we call upon you to pour out your Spirit upon this nation and her peoples this day in the aftermath of our national and local elections. As some rejoice today and as others mourn, remind us all of all that binds us to one another. Remind us that the brother, the sister, the friend, the co-worker, the Rotarian, whom we have known and loved before, is the same person we know and love today. Remind us of the words of Lincoln, who said, we are not enemies, but friends. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. Perhaps most important, let us all remember our calling as individuals in all seasons to do good, to serve our neighbor, and to work for justice and peace. Bless all those who have been elected to serve, and let them be guided by love and compassion and work for justice and peace. Bless our speaker today, the food we have received, the hands that have prepared and served it. To you, the Lord of love and the God of justice and mercy, we pray. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you, Past President Miller. I'm pleased to have the honor today of introducing our guests for today's meeting. When I call your name, I'd ask that you please stand and remain standing until President Courtney has welcomed you. Amy Serafino, guest of Joan Mummert. Enoch Sam, guest of Thomas Caltagirone. Deb Best and Rebecca Robinson, both guests of Brian Grimm. Thank you.
Visitors, I trust that your experience today is filled with great lunch, fellowship, and some fantastic community leaders, and a program that will inform and inspire you. Thank you for being our guest today, and please come visit us again anytime. Rotarians, please join me in welcoming our guests. And now for some announcements. The program committee will meet today at 1:30 in the Elmer Smith room here at the Country Club. To find that room, you just turn left when you exit this room. The Service Project Development Committee, or the Speedy Committee, will meet today at 1:30 in the Terrence room. Turn the other way, turn right. It's right where we had the buffet today, near that room. The Rotary Board of Directors will meet tomorrow at 8 a.m. on Zoom, and the PPE Committee will meet on November 13th at 8 a.m. on Zoom. The Membership Engagement Committee would like to extend a congratulations to past President Rob Bowen on his 35th anniversary of being a member of the Rotary Club of York. Rob, thank you very much for being a valued member of our club. There he is. I invite all Rotarians who are military veterans to participate in our annual Vets Day program parade of veterans at our meeting next Wednesday, November 13th. All veterans may wear their uniforms if they choose and are asked to assemble at 11:45 a.m. for a photo, followed by the parade. And just a reminder, due to the upcoming holidays, we will not hold weekly meetings on November 27th, December 25th, and January 1st. And now I invite Leanne Wilson, chair of our club's Youth Leadership Committee, to the podium to share with you a committee spotlight. And as she's coming up, I want to give you a reminder on what a committee spotlight is. The purpose of doing a committee spotlight is so that a committee can share awareness of what they do, as well as share how their committee ties to our club's mission statement and strategic plan. Leanne, take it away.
Youth leadership's purpose is to develop and conduct activities to foster youth leadership. The most recognizable activity that you would know from our committee is when we have local high school juniors join us to be recognized as Students of the Month. The high school students have the opportunity to attend the Rotary Youth Leadership Academy, also known as RYLA, in June, where they get to interact with other students, foster their leadership skills, and learn more about Rotary. We also give out the Rotary Service Awards to students at the 3 local colleges. And we also promote the district-wide essay contest focused on the 4-way test. With the club's new strategic direction, we redefined the criteria of Students of the Month to be York City residents, and we are focusing on the schools that are within the city limits. It was also a great opportunity to consider other areas to expand the reach of this committee. Historically, the Students of the Month would join us for lunch, and then there's not too much interaction beyond that. One new goal is offering a youth leadership event that will be unique to Rotary, offer interaction with our club members, and keep youth engaged. And the plan is to include the Students of the Month alumni so that we might be able to recruit them in the future. There are 4 youth-related committees in the club, and we've already broken down any silos that may have existed by coordinating with each other. As Youth Service Projects is establishing goals, we are collaborating together for a student summit on November 23rd. This is where we want to hear from youth on the issues that matter to them. The Students of the Month alumni have already been invited to this event. I'm excited about the possibility that we might have students in youth leadership driving a youth service project to benefit youth literacy. But there's a lot more to go on that, but that's just some of those bigger ideas as we work on our new strategic goals. We also will be strengthening the relationships with the York City School District to provide support where they need it most. So as we establish these new youth activities, we will, of course, welcome all club members to engage with our committee and the youth of York City. If you're interested in helping out, find me, Leanne Wilson, in Club Runner, or of course after a meeting. And if you happen to know of any youth, please invite them November 23rd to our Student Summit. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. And now I invite Jeff Vermeulen to the podium to introduce our program for today.
Thank you, Courtney. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today as a colleague of mine at York College. Dr. Nicolas Anspach is a professor of political science at the York College of Pennsylvania, where he teaches courses on politics and the news media, campaigns and elections, and political attitudes. His research interests include online misinformation, political mobilization, and emotional reactions to politics. Timely, I think. I couldn't make this up. He is the recipient of the American Political Science Association's Timothy Cook Award in Political Communication and the York College Presidential Award for Excellence in Faculty Scholarship. He will be speaking with us today about the results of yesterday's election, at least what we know so far, the key turning points that helped to determine the outcomes that we know so far, and what we might expect in the coming days and weeks as we transition to a new administration. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Nick is also a local resident. He did his undergraduate work at Shippensburg University, originally come from Harrisburg, and did his doctoral and master's degrees at Temple University. And he also told me something very interesting about himself just now. In 2018, he received the bronze medal competing in Jeopardy. So but it's still a medal, Nick, and I don't know many other people that have competed on Jeopardy. So congratulations. With that, Rotarians, if you could join me in welcoming Dr. Nick Anspach.
Thank you, Jeff, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming out today. I thought by now we'd all be sick of the election, but maybe not. During that introduction, I think I just received another text asking me for more money for the 2026 midterm elections. So I don't know if you were like me, but I was up late watching the results come in, and I was up early to put these slides together. So this is very much a snap reaction to the outcome, but I hope what I have here is insightful and provides some insight into the Trump's victory. So here's how things stand as of around 8 a.m. this morning. Some states still haven't been called yet, but if we freeze the lead now and assume that's how things are going to stand, this is as close to a landslide as we've seen in recent years. Obama in 2008 and then Trump in 2024 are as close to landslides as possible. If things stand, Trump is going to win all 7 battleground states, including us here in Pennsylvania. He had won a lot of the battlegrounds in 2016, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, but he added Nevada to his total this year. So he is doing even better than he did in 2016. A couple reasons why Trump won and Harris underperformed. Let's go back to over the summer when Joe Biden was the presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party. You might remember Donald Trump and Joe Biden had a debate in the summer, and that seemed awfully early to hold a presidential debate. Usually these things happen in September or October, closer to Election Day. But the Biden campaign thought, hey, we need to get Joe Biden out in front of the public to show that he is not infirm. Turns out the opposite happened. A lot of people saw that debate and they said, oh my goodness, the Democrats have to replace this guy as the nominee. He did not do particularly well, and enthusiasm on the Democratic side was at an ebb. Also, Joe Biden, could I have the, was facing pretty high disapproval numbers. Now, I won't bore you with all the political science behind predicting presidential elections, but when it comes down to predicting presidential elections, 3 things seem to matter the most. One of those 3 things is presidential approval rating. Not surprising, if a president has a low approval rating, it is harder for that party to win re-election. A 38 or 39% presidential approval rating is very bad for an incumbent. So already Joe Biden was looking at an uphill battle to maintain the presidency. Combine that with his poor debate performance, and it's probably no surprise that the Democrats thought it necessary to replace him as the top of the ticket. And that's what happened. The presumptive heir was Kamala Harris as Biden's vice president. And when Biden decided to step back and Kamala became the presumptive nominee, you saw a real upswell of enthusiasm among the Democrats. In fact, the Democrats broke fundraising records in the days and weeks following Biden's stepping back and Harris becoming the presumptive nominee. Here's a headline that says Harris donations top 100 million after Biden's exit from the presidential race. But unfortunately for Harris and unfortunately for Democrats, that momentum could not be maintained. What we have here is a statistician. His name is Nate Silver. What Nate Silver does is he takes all the polls that are conducted, aggregates them together, and uses those polls to predict who is going to win the presidential election. Now, if you can see right here, that steep drop was Biden after the debate. But you can see after Biden steps back and Harris takes over, you see a gradual rise in the blue line. You can see Harris's chances of winning get better soon after Biden steps back. But if you look at that blue line, it flattens out as we get closer to the election. The Democrats weren't able to maintain that momentum. Why not? Well, that leads me to my next point, is that Harris was either unwilling or unable to separate herself from Joe Biden. On one hand, this isn't surprising. Kamala Harris is Joe Biden's vice president. She is part of the administration, and to a certain degree, she is responsible for whatever Biden's policies went into effect. But also, Kamala Harris was put in a difficult position here. She's glad Joe Biden stepped away. She's glad she is a presumptive nominee, but she can't exactly throw Joe Biden under the bus completely because she was part of that administration. So she has to pay homage, if you will, to Joe Biden and what he did while in office. That allowed Trump and the Republicans to tie Kamala Harris to some of Biden's more unpopular policies, whether it's issues of immigration, whether it's LGBT rights, or whether it's the performance of the economy. Now, you might remember I said that there are three things that political scientists say are very important to determining a presidential election. The first is the presidential approval rating. The second is the performance of the economy. Now, there are a few different ways to interpret the performance of the economy. Do we look at GDP? Do we look at unemployment rate? But I think for this election, the most important metric of the economy was inflation. And what I'm showing you here is the consumer price index over time, going back to the 80s with Ronald Reagan. And you can see during the worst portions of inflation under Biden's administration, we haven't seen levels of inflation that bad since the Reagan years. This is something that's going to stick out in the minds of voters. And even though prices have come down, you can see inflation has fallen quite a bit in 2024. That didn't matter so much, or at least I would argue, it didn't matter quite so much in the minds of the voters, because we remember that inflation, we remember how bad it was, and I think the Trump campaign did a very good job of pegging Biden and Harris's policies to inflation. Also, I want to point out that, of course, the United States isn't the only country that experienced inflation during this point. Economists would argue it was due to COVID. Things had shut down, and then when things opened back up again, the economy overheated, inflation skyrocketed, and that we see that around the world. And I will note that every incumbent party in every Western democracy that had as an election lost following that election. What I mean by that is whoever was in power, whatever party was in power of that country at the time inflation hit, regardless of ideology, regardless if inflation came back down, every party who was in power during that period of inflation lost. We saw the Conservative Party in England, in Great Britain, lose. We saw the moderates in France lose. And now we see the Democrats in the United States lose. So when I talk about the three main things that determine a presidential election, presidential approval rating did not favor the Democrats, and perceptions of the economy certainly didn't favor the Democrats either. I will just say before I move on to my next point on the slide, the third element of what determines a presidential election is how long that party has been in power, the incumbency. As Americans, we don't like it when one party has been in power too long. And it's usually, okay, we'll give a party 2 terms as president, and then we're ready for a switch. That one maybe favored the Democrats because the Democrats had only had 1 term under Biden, but the other 2 definitely favored the Republican Party. Another element that I think helped determine this outcome is Trump's avoidance of mainstream media. Usually in a typical campaign, as we get closer to election day, candidates do media blitzes. They go on interviews so they can espouse their policies, so they can win over voters. Trump avoided that. He was scheduled to be on 60 Minutes, and he backed out about a week before the interview. A few days later, he was scheduled to be on CNBC. He had backed out of that interview as well. Kamala Harris asked Trump to have a second debate. It would have been scheduled just a few weeks ago, and he turned that down as well. Now, on one hand, we've had Trump in politics since 2015. There's not much to be learned about who he is as a candidate. So I don't know how much we would have learned about Trump had he sit down with 60 Minutes. But on the other hand, by avoiding these interviews, he is avoiding what he sees as a hostile media environment. And maybe he's right, because I'm a little bit old school when it comes to journalism, and I do think journalists' job is to hold those in power accountable, to challenge them on issues. Kamala Harris sat down for those interviews, and she was challenged. And then the media environment today, with all the punditry, it gave the media environment, punditry, and even voters a chance to pick apart Kamala Harris's answers and find flaws in them. Trump, maybe smartly, avoided those media encounters altogether, instead focusing on his rallies, where he feeds off the energy of his crowd, and instead spending a lot of time on friendly outlets like Fox News. Here he is sitting down with Fox and Friends a couple weeks before the election. Friendly territory where he knows he's going to be given friendly questions. And the last point I want to talk about before I talk about transitioning to a new Trump administration is the ground game strategy. I made the joke when I got up here that I got another text asking for money. You saw the ads. Maybe you've had people knocking on your doors or calling you. The traditional strategy when it comes to the ground game has been to identify and mobilize people that you agree with. You agree with, or they agree with you because of their party registration, or because maybe they're involved in certain clubs or social organizations that share the same values as the party. And what a candidate's team will do is knock on their door or call them and say, hey, it's important you get out and vote. We don't see too much of persuasion anymore. We live in such a polarized country these days that Kamala Harris would have a very difficult time going to a Trump voter and saying, hey, abandon Trump and vote for us. The same is true in reverse. Not many Harris voters would be voting for Trump. And this is the strategy that the Harris campaign adopted. Leading up to the election, they have released some numbers that they had 2,500 staff across the country and 358 field offices. And the narrative was that Harris was winning the ground game because Trump didn't have a ground game. And that's not hyperbole. That's not exaggeration. Like, Trump really did not have a ground game. He had a new strategy, and that was to identify and mobilize new voters, people who don't have a history of voting for one party or the other. Full disclosure, I voted for Kamala Harris yesterday. We have a Kamala Harris yard sign in my yard, and we got 3 people knocking on our doors in the 3 weeks leading up to the elections, more phone calls than I can think of. And I can't help but wonder, was the Harris campaign wasting their resources on someone like me? I teach political science. I'm a registered Democrat. I voted in every election I'm able to. Like, I was going to be voting for Harris whether or not somebody knocked on my door. The Trump campaign, again, probably smartly, said, you know what, there's probably not much utility in trying to mobilize people who already agree with us, people who already vote for Trump. Instead, we want to find people who didn't vote at all. We want to mobilize those people, bring new people into the electorate and get them to vote for Donald Trump. But Donald Trump didn't do that himself. Instead, what he did was he outsourced the ground game to what are called PACs, political action committees. Think of them as interest groups and organizations that do politicking. They're not affiliated with the campaign, but they do politicking alone. The Trump campaign said, hey, my PACs, you guys can go out and do that. He had Elon Musk, his America PAC, had the ground game. They use paid workers to knock on doors rather than volunteers. I actually got invited to work for the America PAC to knock on doors on behalf of Donald Trump, which, as I said, I'm an obvious Harris voter, but they didn't care. They said, hey, we'll pay you $30 an hour if you go knock on doors on behalf of Donald Trump. And if, someone wants to make a little bit of extra cash, maybe it's a good way to do so. Now, I will say that the political class and the punditry, they thought this approach was silly. At the time, I saw Washington Post articles and BBC articles saying, oh my goodness, Trump is throwing away this election by not having a ground game. But we saw the results of last night, where 2024 is Trump's best performance of any of his elections. So don't be surprised if come the next few elections, we see more candidates adopting this sort of strategy, trying to bring people into the electorate rather than mobilizing those who have already voted. Whether or not that's successful for anyone other than Donald Trump, I think is still to be seen. I think Trump has a certain charisma about him where he is able to mobilize people who aren't your traditional voters, who haven't engaged in politics in the traditional way before. Whether another candidate can capture that lightning in the bottle, we'll see. So just a little bit more about the results. What we have here is a map of the shift compared to 2020. And I would apologize for the slide, but even if we had it on our screens in front of us, it's hard to read. But what it's showing is a bunch of red and blue arrows pointing left and right to indicate how much that area of the country has shifted compared to the results of 2020. And even if you can't see the size of the arrows, you can see that is a very, very red map. Trump outperformed his 2020 metrics by a lot. Now, why is that? It's the morning after, we're not quite sure. Part of it is that perhaps mail-in voting isn't as partisan as it was in 2020, so Republicans were able to capture or get more people to vote early. Maybe it was the economy. Maybe it was Kamala Harris's underperformance with minority groups. I saw one exit poll where Joe Biden won the Hispanic community by 30 points in 2020. Kamala Harris won it by 4 points in 2024. That's a big shift among the Latino community, who tends to be socially conservative. So maybe these LGBT issues that Donald Trump raised, maybe that resonated with the Latino community. Also, there's a narrative of Kamala Harris struggling with Black men. Perhaps her role as in criminal justice as a prosecutor in California had something to do with that. A lot of African-American men inherently distrust the judicial system because of inherent biases there. So whatever the reason, though, Donald Trump did very, very well in 2024. But of course, it wasn't just only the presidential election last night. We also have some congressional races. As you know, all of the House was up for grabs, and then a third of the Senate. We had a Senate race here in Pennsylvania. Right now, Republicans are poised to take the Senate. That's not a surprise, just given the way the map looked. Democrats were mostly playing defense, so the Republicans had a lot of opportunity to pick up seats in the Senate. But even still, there were some surprises in the Senate, including here in Pennsylvania. A lot of the polls had our incumbent, Bob Casey, the Democrat, well ahead. It looks like Bob Casey will lose his seat to challenger Republican Dave McCormick. This race has not been called yet, but you can see here there's over 95% of the votes have been tallied. My understanding is that you also invited Scott Perry and Janelle Stelzen in recently. They had their congressional race. Whoever wins that is going to help determine who controls the House. Right now, you need 218 seats to take the House of Representatives. Republicans are currently ahead. They are slight favorites to keep the House. And if that's the case, Donald Trump will have unified government. By that, I mean we will have a Republican president, a Republican Senate, and a Republican House. So they will be able to legislate much more easily than if Democrats had controlled one of those institutions. I mentioned the Scott Perry and Janelle Stelzen race. For much of the night, at least while I was watching, Janelle Stelzen was ahead, but that was because Cumberland County and Dauphin County got their results in quickly. York County, as the results came in, Scott Perry pulled ahead, and it looks like he will maintain that seat. What else? Well, Trump has 4 different criminal cases that he is facing, including one that he was found guilty of in New York on 34 felony charges. Even though Donald Trump was found guilty of those 34 felony charges, he has not been sentenced yet. That judge delayed sentencing until after the election. Now that Donald Trump will be president, I would be very, very surprised if that judge tried to throw Donald Trump in jail, or the president-elect in jail. I would be very surprised if he got anything at all besides a slap on the wrist. There are also 3 other criminal cases, one in Washington, D.C., that's the January 6th case, one in Georgia, that's the election interference case, and one in Florida, that's the documents case. I would suspect those are all done. I just cannot imagine that the courts will allow investigations in criminal cases against the president-elect to proceed. And then the question is, well, what's the future look like for both parties? Starting with the Democrats, the losers, there's always going to be some soul searching there. I think the most obvious question is, were they mistaken in replacing Joe Biden on the top of the ticket? Of course, we don't know what the election outcome would have been had Joe Biden stayed on the top of the ticket, but I think Biden would have lost anyways. I think between the low approval rating and the economic indicators, I think the Democrats had an uphill battle no matter who was at the top of the ticket. Instead, if it turns out that Kamala Harris did underperform with minority groups, that is something the Democrats are going to have to reckon with, because these are groups that the Democrats have traditionally done well with. And if Republicans are making inroads with that group, it's going to be hard for the Democrats to win national elections going forward. On the Republican side, they're celebrating tonight. I think had Donald Trump lost, it would have been the end of Trump's campaign style. I actually thought that at the end of 2020, after the January 6th insurrection, we saw the pundit class again, and even some fellow Republicans say we have to shut the door on Donald Trump, that he was almost seen as toxic to the party. But memories are short, and as Trump reemerged as a candidate and he's won the nomination, Republicans fell in line behind their nominee, and this is still very much Trump's party. And the fact that he performed better in 2024 than he did in either of his other elections shows that his brand of politics can win elections. Now, Trump, he's our oldest elected president now. He's even older than Joe Biden was in 2020. He will be done with politics at the end of his term, but I believe Trump's style politics will probably live on even after he is done with this term, whether it's J.D. Vance or somebody else. I would think, this kind of bombastic, incendiary rhetoric, it finds an audience and it can win elections. So that's all I have for you today. I hope you found some things insightful. And besides that, I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it is. So you opened the presentation saying that the results this morning are indicative of a landslide, at least in recent history, which is a bit of an antithesis of what the polls have been telling us for quite some time. And this is, I think, a trend we're seeing in the polls. What do you feel that the pollsters either cannot or will not do to get this right?
That's a fantastic question. I think the pollsters are going to have a lot of soul searching today, because this is the 3rd election in a row where they have underestimated how much Trump, the share of the vote he should have. I'll mention in 2016 and 2020, Trump lost the popular vote, both those elections. He won the popular vote this time. I think they underestimated, according to the count I saw, Trump by about 3 percentage points, which is a smaller miss than 2016 and 2020, but still underestimating Trump. I don't have the answer for what the polling industry can do to fix this, but what I can say is what they've tried to do. If I had the answer, I'd go get a hotshot job I'd be the New York Times new polling guy. Right now, response rates to polls are about 0.5%, meaning you have to contact a lot of people just to get anyone to respond to your polls. So getting a good sample of the broader population is very, very, very difficult. So what pollsters do is they weight their responses. Let's say, for example, I conduct a poll of 100 people, and in that poll, I have 75 Democrats. That's not a good sample, right? Party identification is more or less split here. So what I would do to adjust for the oversampling of Democrats in my poll is I would weight their responses as less, and I would rate Republican responses as worth more. But those weights haven't worked. And the pollsters have tried weighting by party identification. They've tried weighting by past vote. Oh, if I did a sample and, 80% of my sample says they voted for Biden in 2020, well, I got too many Biden voters in my sample. So I got to weight them less and weight Trump samples more. They weight by education. They weight by race. None of these weights have seemed to accurately capture Donald Trump's support in America. The problem rests with the low response rates. It's very, very hard to get a representative sample, but they haven't been able to take those bad samples and do some statistical trickery to how to get it out there. But expect more come 2026 and 2028.
Thank you for being here. This might be a little bit out of your purview, but I believe someone has recently said something about the difficulty of a 24-hour news cycle on democracy itself. Can you comment on your thoughts?
Sure. So as Jeff mentioned, I study the politics in the news media, and I study emotion in politics. And I'm critical of the 24-hour networks, but I understand why they do what they do. They have 24 hours to fill every day. And even though I'm critical of the networks, they provide that style of news that we're all familiar with, the emotional, the sensationalistic, because that's what the audience wants. If the news tried to lecture us on the details of policy and tax implications, we would change the channel. 24-hour networks know that, so they provide the infotainment, the sensationalistic. But I also think the media has to have a reckoning with how they treat these candidates. Now, Kamala Harris sat down for more interviews than Donald Trump. That gave the 24-hour news cycles something to talk about. They need to fill up that time. Donald Trump didn't sit down for those interviews. So instead, we're relying on what he said on rallies and things like that. The 24-hour news networks, I think, are contributing, especially MSNBC, which favors the Democrats, and Fox News, which favors the Republicans. I think it's contributing to a lot of the polarization we see in American politics. Now, not those two networks don't have the audiences that mainstream outlets do. Mainstream outlet news, it's better. It's not great, but it's better. But I also think those 24-hour networks reward those politicians who are the most bombastic and the most confrontational, because those are the ones who get on TV. This was especially true in 2016, where all three networks would cover Trump all the time. Hillary Clinton and even Trump's Republican primary opponents were ignored because viewers tuned in because they wanted to see Trump. And now if you look at who's on Fox News or MSNBC, it's the most conservative or the most liberal on each side. And there are rewards for being extreme from the 24-hour network. So I'm not, they're on my list, I'll put it that way.
Thank you, Professor. That was really a very good explanation. I mean, helpful to me anyway. My question relates to what I see and what has come out in the press. The finger of the government guiding, call it news or call it information with respect to the networks, where in your introduction, you were going to mention the question of misinformation, et cetera. This to me is pressing the issue of free speech and free opinion, where our government actually does put their finger and pressures these organizations to go in the direction that they want it to go.
That's a great question. I think one we'll be grappling with for quite a while, because as you know, the First Amendment creates a permissive environment for news outlets, for social media companies, where There's nothing in the Constitution that says, oh, you have First Amendment rights if it's true, right? You have First Amendment rights. You have First Amendment rights, and it's broad and expansive, even if it's misinformation. Now, there's a normative question there of whether the government should try to regulate misinformation on social media. But then there's a practical question as well. I think we would all agree that if we could remove misinformation from the media environment, that would be good for our democracy. But practically, I don't know how you even begin to do that. I heard an NPR report recently about somebody who worked at Facebook who was charged with removing misinformative and graphic and violent posts from Facebook. And these people would get burned out within 3 months of working because they would see the most heinous things posted online. And imagine, I mean, we're all annoyed by what we see on social media. Imagine if that was your job all day, every day, to troll through these sorts of posts. So practically speaking, it would be very, very hard to combat the volume of misinformation that's out there. So instead, what political scientists and communication scholars have looked at is how can we inoculate people against misinformation? How can people identify misinformation when they see it? And how can we disabuse them of those notions once they come to believe it? Some of the conspiracy theories we see. This is more the thrust of the research I'm familiar with, because actually removing misinformation between the First Amendment and the practical consideration seems like an impossible task. So inoculating people against misinformation, journalists would be the first ones to say, hey, this is true or false, but there's a crisis in journalism right now where half the country doesn't believe what the media is telling them. Social media outlets like Facebook and Twitter have adopted their own strategies of flagging misinformative comments. That has some success. But what we find is that if misinformation aligns with somebody's partisan beliefs, they're more likely to believe it. We want to believe our side is right. And then if you have politicians out there also spouting misinformation, well, someone in power is saying it, someone in Congress is saying it, a presidential candidate is saying it, it has to be true, right? And there's no ramifications for that. So this misinformation environment is a serious concern. It's one of my main research agendas. And again, like the polling question, it's one that remains unanswered.
Thank you for sharing your expertise and insights. You mentioned new voters were a factor in the election, and I was surprised to learn today that our daughter's good friend and her spouse were first-time voters at 29 years old. So I was curious how many new voters were engaged in this election. Do you think they'll be maintained, and how will the parties court them?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't have the numbers yet for how many first-time voters are here. Turnout is particularly high, which suggests quite a few new voters. As far as whether new voters will stick around, I think that's an open question, and one I alluded to in the talk, where there's something about Donald Trump. It's almost like a cult of personality. The Trump supporters really, really like Donald Trump. They decorate their houses and their trucks with Donald Trump paraphernalia. Whether or not another Republican candidate is able to capture that sort of dynamic once Trump is done with this term, I think is an open question. But Trump's success this election shows that the way he conducts his politics can win. So I wouldn't be surprised if other Republican or Democratic candidates, for that matter, try the bombastic style. I just don't know if it's a Trump phenomenon and whether somebody else can repeat it. I probably didn't answer your question completely, but we don't have the numbers yet on completely new voters.
During the Reagan administration, I think, from what I understand, the regulation for journalism, they've eliminated to present both sides of an argument. Do you think that was the start of the polarization that we see today?
It might have been. So for those of you unfamiliar with what we're talking about, there was 3 regulations on broadcast media that were challenged in the Supreme Court. The first is still in effect. It's the equal time provision. If I offer time to one candidate to air ads, I have to make the same offer to another candidate. That way networks aren't putting their fingers on the scale. Another is a right of rebuttal, where if a network criticizes a candidate, that candidate has the right to be invited onto that network to respond. The other is the fairness doctrine, which is you're referencing. The idea that when broadcast networks reported on, it was broadly defined, important news, they had to present both sides of an argument. And as you mentioned, that regulation, even though it was challenged and upheld in the 60s at the Supreme Court during the Reagan administration, they got rid of that doctrine. The idea was, with the advent of cable news in the 1980s, all perspectives would be covered. So we don't need outlets to cover both sides, because if you wanted the conservative perspective, well, you can tune into Fox News. And if you want the liberal perspective, you can tune into MSNBC. So you would get both sides if you wanted it. But that's the key there, if you wanted it. Because I think a lot of people are going to be watching one of these channels or the other, but not both. So I think you're onto something. When we got rid of the fairness doctrine, networks were no longer required to present both sides of an argument. Instead, they could just do one. And so what we've ended up with is a very fragmented media environment where you can opt into whatever news you prefer to hear. And it becomes that echo chamber where you get your opinions echoed back at you. And that's just TV, right? You add in social media and the internet as well, and we're living in our own bubbles. I think you're onto something there. Absolutely.
Thanks. This has been a really great, informative, and decompression conversation. So thank you for that. You mentioned the three main things that determine an election outcome. Are there any models, or are we gathering data on perhaps gender being one of those?
So no, turnout, well, let me say this. Political scientists love to try to reinvent things. The model I'm talking about was from the 80s, and it has accurately predicted the popular vote winner of every presidential election. And some of the old school political scientists say, hey, if this predicts things, why fix what's not broken? Other scholars would disagree and say, well, we have to model turnout, or we have to model campaign spending, or we have to model gender, things along those lines. But the simplest model suggests the campaign doesn't matter, which is crazy when you think about all the hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars spent on a campaign. Because the three things that I said predicts an outcome is economy. Campaign doesn't change the economy. Presidential approval rating. Maybe, you know, a successful campaign could bump up an incumbent president a little bit. But, you know, if you look at the presidential approval rating I had for Joe Biden, it was, it was pretty steady for a long time. And then the third thing is incumbency. A campaign can't change incumbency. So while models do exist that look at who turns out, the simplest and best one is looking at things that the campaign can't change. That's why I'm skeptical that no matter who is at the top of the ticket, the Democrats would have had an uphill battle.
What is your take on outside interference in this election? I heard a report on my favorite bubble, NPR, that outside interference did not appear to be a huge factor this year, although there was the email campaign threatening violence at certain polling places, but that seemed to be the only highlight.
I think the idea of outside interference determining an election is a dangerous road to go down, because if you're losing elections, it's because the voters don't like what you're offering. But if you say, well, we only lost the election because Russia interfered or China interfered, it makes an excuse for you to maintain your policies that are unpopular with the voters. So in 2016, you know, you saw some of the camp say, oh, you know, we only lost because Russia interfered. And in 2020, Trump said, oh, I only lost because there was voter fraud. And it's like, well, no, you probably lost because the voters weren't buying what you were selling. I think it's still too early to see how Democrats assign blame in this. But I'm with you. I haven't heard much about outside influence affecting this outcome. The only thing that I say, there was bomb threats in Georgia and Arizona at some of the polling places yesterday. They had to close for a little bit. those bomb threats, if you didn't, they originated from Russia. So Russia is interfering with our elections. But those polling places that had to close for a little bit, they stayed open a little bit later. But I think in the grand scheme of things, that's pretty minor in determining the outcome.
Thank you, Dr. Anspach, for providing us with such a comprehensive and insightful look into the results of this election. On behalf of the club, we truly appreciate your time and expertise today. As you all know, instead of giving the speakers a gift, we purchase a book and we ask them to sign the book plate and we donate it locally. This week's book will be donated to the YWCA Learning Center along with a bookmark made by the students at Creative York. Next week, we will hear from Major General Wesley Craig, retired Adjutant General of Pennsylvania. In his previous role, he commanded the Pennsylvania National Guard and was responsible for the Veterans Affairs of Pennsylvania. He is speaking to us as a representative of the employer support of the Guard and Reserve, an agency of the U.S. Department of Defense, also referred to as ESGR. ESGR works with employers to ensure that they support and value the military service of their employees, and he will discuss the current operations of the PA Guard and how ESGR supports both the warfighter and their employers. This meeting is now adjourned.